paper is still in flux a bit, so we actually have an updated version of it. So I guess my only kind of small piece of advertising I'll do is say that there will be a new version of the paper. And it might even be interactive. If you ask the right questions, we might change it based on that also. Jesper unfortunately couldn't be here. It would have been nice to have him here, but maybe he's watching the streaming. If you think the quality of the fonts or the images are bad, for some reason the streaming doesn't want to use anything above 800 times 600 in resolution. We don't know why. We're just going with it. The theme of this conference is player experience, and I'm kind of happy we managed to get in a paper which really can't be talking about that, can it? It's a zero-player game. There are no players. There can't be any experiences, can there? We'll see about that later. So let's see. Yeah, the background for this story. Why did Jesper and I want to look at these kinds of games? It's actually due to a discussion on the Games Network list, where there were some comments made by other game researchers that games don't exist unless they're being played. And we can see what they're trying to say with that, but if you just take it literally, it sounds a bit weird, and it sounds like you can miss a lot of interesting things about the game phenomena as a whole. So we decided, well, let's look at this, because these types of games, zero-player games, because they seem to defy that statement. So in another way, one could say that what we're looking at is really, do games need people? Can't we just look at games? Can't games be interesting or have a value or have meaning in itself? Do they always require people or players? We're not going to give one definite answer, what's right or wrong. We just want to open up for discussion and opening up for more possibilities. That's the aim, I would say. So we started off by saying, okay, on a discussion on the web, some people were saying some things. It's more like talking than writing, so people might not be expressing themselves with a granularity that they really mean something. So we said, well, let's go and look in books and papers published and see if people do say the same things here. So we looked around a bit, and we found some quotes, which we kind of see as arguing the case that players are really important in games in different ways. So one we found by Emery and Meyere, yet the essence of a game is rooted in its interactive nature, and there is no game without a player. So taking at face value, games don't exist unless there are players. You can probably find a couple of interpretations to this if you want to. Kind of, you can't define or describe a game without describing what players are, or that games don't exist if they're not being played. But players are important. Another one by Mia Consalvo, you have to say something if you're quoted out of context or if there's an error. Games are created through the act of gameplay, which is contingent on player acts. So there's something which is called a player which acts. It doesn't really say what a player is. Neither does the quote above, just that players are important. We found a couple of others. One, a player can take the same game and completely make it strikingly different experiences. Make of it strikingly different experiences. So, of course, players influence the experience of a game while playing it. Another one, Gordon, where are you? I don't see him anywhere. He escaped. Most importantly, a game becomes a game when it is being played. Until then, it is only a set of rules and game props awaiting human engagement. So games don't exist until humans come and engage in it. And he doesn't actually say players anywhere. So I'm assuming here that humans are the players, right? And this also makes excellent sense if you think of his presentation, what he's interested in. No problem whatsoever. But it might be a bit limiting. There might be other things we can see about games. So one could say that these statements express a kind of player-centric approach to researching games, which we're sympathetic to, because players are obviously an important part of games, we would say. We don't disagree on that. Where we might disagree is when we're saying it's the only interesting thing, or when it's expressed that this is the only thing one can study. There might be more perspectives. So, of course, one could say game-centric approach. We can just look at the game, if that is the artifact or the activity, and not look at players. You could probably find a lot of interesting things about games, the game phenomenon, by doing that as well. But that can also go too far, ignoring the players altogether. So we don't want to do that, because then we're just basically setting up two camps which can fight each other. So we wanted to do something else. And what we came up with was looking at zero-player games, which is a concept we had heard about before. None of us had really studied, but we knew what kind of was mentioned as the typical examples, and we felt we knew a couple of other examples which could fit. So we could start looking at these, start exploring these. This is, I can make this more interactive. Do you know what this is? Anybody? Conway's Game of Life. So it's cellular automata, you could actually say. It's basically a system where there's a lot of squares. They can be white or black, and there are rules transforming them. So depending on how many neighbors you are, you'll be white or black the next turn for each square. This is called a game. It's called a zero-player game by Carlyle in his Encyclopedia of Play in Today's Society, I think the reference is. Because the typical way you play this is you decide which cells should be white and which should be black, and then you turn on the system, and you don't do anything. You observe what happens. Most implementations of it actually allow you to mess around with it afterwards, but the way it's described, you should just set it up and see what happens. And you could complain this isn't a game because it hasn't any rules, or it isn't a game because you can't interact with it after you set it up. But people call it a game, so we'll tag along with that. If some people call it a game, we'll say that it is a game. In what way is this interesting? What people have done with this is that they noticed that you can actually make some interesting things with it. For example, the square of 4 cells there is a stable form. It will keep like that forever until something gets into its proximity. But you can also make things which move, which is stable but moves. And you can make more complex things. People have built things which replicate themselves, so they grow forever. They made things which makes copies of themselves and then destroys the original. People have shown that this is Turing equivalent, so it's actually possible to make computers in this. So you can make all computer games within this, which is kind of interesting in itself. So you can, it's a game which can make other games or something. But are you playing it? What's the player's role here? We would call this a kind of a setup-only game. You do a setup, and then this game system updates itself until it comes to an end condition, in the pure form of it. There are other examples of games like this, we would argue. The Incredible Machine series, which was popular, I think, in the 80s. They made some versions in the 90s. I missed those. Here, you basically get a puzzle. You're supposed to, there's a starting condition and there's a goal condition, which you'll try to achieve by placing different weird things like ropes, lights, sensors. I think they're cats and rats as well. But basically, the gameplay is you set up what you think is a solution, and then you press play and you see what happens. If you made the right construction, you complete the level and continue. Otherwise, you fail. So there's one sense where you set up, and then there's one sense when you see what happens. You could argue that the actual play is in the beginning and not in the execution. But in some cases, setting it up can be quite a simple thing, and then watching it can take quite a long time. And it might be, the fun might be seeing if it fails or succeeds there. So it's also questioning, when do you play the game? Do you play it when you're doing this? You could find other examples of this. Jesper mentioned Peggle as an example of it, actually, because you choose a direction to shoot the ball, and then you have to wait to see what happens. In some cases, you can do some small modifications, but basically, you could argue that Peggle is also a setup-only game. There's a board game, Czech board game called Space Alert, which basically consists of you together with some other players making decisions for about 10 minutes, and then there's an equal amount of time where you just go through what happened. So you can't make any choices there. You could argue that that's a setup phase. It has a long setup phase, and so on. So there are some other examples of it. Yes, another one, Progress Quest. Anybody familiar with Progress Quest? Yeah, which is kind of a critique of EverQuest on grinding. It's a game, you can download it from the web, you install it, you create your character by saying which class and name it should have. Then the system sends it out on quests to collect things, kill monsters, go back and sell things, level up. You don't have to do anything. It's automated all the boring stuff with MMORPGs. So you only do a small setup, and you can actually let it run forever. There are high score lists for it, which just consists of letting your computer be on. So the player interaction can be put into question there also. Another way of making zero-player games is using AIs. And that's kind of easy to argue in one sense, because if you take a two-player game like chess, if you make an AI, you can play against it. You have a one-player game. Some might argue that it isn't a game at that point. But then if you let two AIs play each other, it's a zero-player game. This is kind of assuming that players are humans. Deep Blue, developed by IBM, is one example of this. This beats all humans nowadays. In all chess competitions, machines win. So chess tournaments might be considered zero-player games nowadays, at least on the top levels. There are other examples. Here's one called Robot Wars. I think it might be from an early Apple computer, but it existed on Unix systems before. In these kinds of games, you have AIs playing each other, typically trying to kill each other. The human involvement in these are in creating the AIs. You write the code, and you can upload it, and you can play against other people's code. You could argue that that is a meta game. That's the true game, and this is not the game, this is something else. But then you could argue, so is chess not a game? It's making the algorithms to play chess, which is the game. You can't ignore that as a game as easily because you can find other examples. There's been a lot of work in these kind of things. There's been people doing algorithms which learn how to play tic-tac-toe over several game instances using marbles and matchboxes. There are people who have done games who can play, I think it's checkers, built on only electronic devices, so analog computers in some sense. But it's been a long history of kind of replacing the human as a player by an AI. And in some sense, you can say that it's a zero-player game. And especially in some of these robot wars, there are never any human players. If you made an AI for it, which was basically an interface to human, you would be cheating. So, another example of this from game theory, I guess, would be Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma. If you're familiar with the Prisoner's Dilemma, which is more a theoretical game, not many people play it with each other, but what people do is make algorithms to play it and then have tournaments about it, and use that as a basis to argue on if you should cooperate or not in various circumstances. Then we have solved games. These are kind of ordinary games, but researchers have looked at them trying to do AIs or trying to just do mathematical proofs to show something. So checkers has been solved in the way that they know that it should end in a draw if everybody plays correctly. So there's a mathematical proof for that. So in some sense, you don't need to play checkers again, ever. There's a game called Hex. Sometimes it's called Nash or John Nash also. That has been proven that the starting player should always win. There isn't a proof what the move should be, but if you play perfectly, you should win if you start. There's mathematical proofs for that. There are proofs for some sizes of the board that the person who begins wins and so on, so you might not play it. So in some sense, these solved games, you can talk about them. You don't need to play them. You can play them, of course, also. I guess there's one game which I think everybody of you have solved, which is tic-tac-toe. Do you play tic-tac-toe anymore nowadays? Is there any point in doing that? But you could still argue it's a game, right? You can discuss playing it and so on. So that's what we mean by solved games, and we would say these are also a type of zero-player games. Then we have what we call hypothetical games. These might actually exist, but they're not really intended to be played so much. You can play them in some cases, but it's more of a thought experiment given form. One example would be Stat Builder. This is a game where you have different kind of abilities, like in role-playing games and so on. The interface is quite simple. There's a button. If you click on that, you improve. And that's what you do. So it kind of has the form of a game. You can click on it, but that's the only thing you can do. You can choose not to play also. But that isn't really, that you could do with any game or any object, I would say. So there's only one thing you could do with it. So it's not really intended to be played. Maybe like Progress Quest isn't intended to be played also. It's more used to show something. When we had discussions about if computer games can be art or not, I would say the people doing these kind of things are trying to make art. They're trying to say something about what games are and criticize it or comment on it. Another example, who knows what the game to the right is? It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of uniqueness. Made by somebody who says he's an artist, or several people actually. I don't remember their names, unfortunately. If you go to the Global Game Jam, you can find it. You can just look for the name on Google also. Basically, this game, when you play it, you start it. It goes out on the web, checks who else is playing the game. It ends their games, so they failed. And then your game starts with a black screen, and then it slowly fills with white. That takes 4 minutes and 33 seconds. If nobody else starts the game while you're playing, you complete it. So you can't actually do any actions on your own in the game. The only thing you can do is choose when to start playing. That's about the gameplay you have in the game, which isn't a lot of gameplay in the game, right? Other people can destroy your gameplay. So I've actually played that, but it makes more sense for me to talk about it. It gives me more meaning to talk about it than to play it. So I would call it definitely a hypothetical game. You don't need to play that game to get some value out of it. You can talk about it with other people now. Let's see if I had more examples in my notes. No? So now I provided you with a bunch of examples of games. You could probably find more of them. What do these games say about games? Well, I would say that's not the interesting question here. The interesting question is actually, what do these games say about players? Because they're called non-player games of some reason. They're actually questioning what is it to be a player. So one thing they typically question is, do players need to be humans? Some of the quotes in the beginning were saying that game needs human engagement. Where are you, Gordon? Others were there. You weren't being misquoted or quoted out of context, right?
I don't know, I was in the bathroom.
Okay, yeah.
You sneak idiot. You told me while I was out of the room.
Yeah. So AI players, or zero-play games where just AIs are meeting each other, are questioning, do players really need to be humans or not? You might answer one way or another way. I tell my students about this, and I make them write an essay, or a small answer at least, if two computer programs meet each other and play chess. Is a game being played or not? They can't fail that question if they answer consistently. But this zero-play games opens up for this question. Another thing, another attribute of players which zero-play games can point out is we typically assume that you have continued agency if you're a player. The setup-only games question this in some sense. Are you a player, or do you have a player in a game if you just do some setup in the beginning and then do nothing else? Because then you might have had some agency in the beginning, but you don't have any afterwards. You might be able to interact in the beginning, but not afterwards. Hypothetical games also do this, because you might not need to play them, or you might not have any interesting choices to make. You can just press a button, but you could automate that with an AI. Making an AI for the stat builder game wouldn't be that difficult, for example. Another thing which the zero-player game takes up is, okay, do players need to be temporal beings? Is it important to see how they do one action, then another, the consequences over time? The solved games don't really need this. Of course, the different proofs you have assume that you're making actions in the way the game says is okay to do. But the value of them afterwards, when you're talking about them, you don't need to kind of assume that a specific player is doing a specific thing. The hypothetical games, basically the same case. So another way of phrasing this is basically asking, do you need to, if you have the idea or the concept of a player, does it need to be instantiated in specific players for a game? It can be instead that the player is an atemporal idea. You just need to talk about the player as an entity, a concept, which has some characteristics, but it doesn't need to do actions. You don't need to follow specific actions. Here's another one, players as having intentionality. So intentionality, you must show that you kind of are trying to perform something. If you're doing an AI player, the AI player needs to seem at least to be wanting to win, and players need to also do that. If they're not, they're spoil sports. But then again, the hypothetical games show where there are no gameplay choices. In Stat Builder, if you just press a button all the time, well, do you have intention to do that or not? It's very difficult to judge because there's no other choices except not playing at all. In the 4 minutes and 33 seconds of uniqueness, you can't do anything. So how can you kind of seem to have any intentionality at all? Game of Life has no goals. There are a lot of other games, of course, besides Game of Life, which doesn't have clear, explicit goals. You have to set up your own goals. But how can you kind of show in Game of Life that the person who played it, who set it up, had certain intentions or not? You can probably look at it and see if they're interesting forms. There might be. If somebody makes something which replicates itself, it will probably interpret it as having intentionality. We don't know if it has it. So the zero-player games can be seen as a way of questioning this as well. So by looking at zero-player games, we kind of can distill characteristics we think players should have, because it's weird if they wouldn't have them. Can we think of some type of player, some example of a game which has players which have no of these characteristics? If you have a suggestion, you'll be quoted or referenced in the upcoming article. No? There's actually one example, fictive players. This is a concept which von Neumann introduced in his book on game theory together with Morgenstern. And it's actually just a tool to be able to take his proofs about zero-sum games and be able to make those proofs work for non-zero-sum games. And the basic trick is basically saying, if you have a game where the end result, if you add up all the scores, all the sums don't end up in zero, add another player. That player isn't allowed to do well for zero-sum games, for non-zero-sum games. And this is a player who can't do any actions. He isn't even allowed to discuss with other people. This is explicitly stated by von Neumann and Morgenstern. So they call it a fictive player. But actually, that fictive player kind of gives us another assumption of what players usually exhibit. That's that they actually want to play. This fictive player doesn't have any say in it. It's just put in there and used to calculate things, to see the effect of the outcome of the game. So that feels kind of weird, right? There's no magic circle where you can choose to enter and so on. 2 minutes, yep. So we typically assume that players have aesthetic preferences, that they want to play certain games or not. Going back to the quotes on players and games, one can say that most players can say, okay, I like StarCraft 2. And then they're not talking about a specific game, a specific activity. They're talking about the game in general. But also when they're playing a game of StarCraft 2, a game instance of StarCraft 2, after the game they can say good game, and they mean this game instance is good. So they do make a differentiation between the activity and the artifact, which are both called games typically. And they can say that they like them and they can't. They can also say, I don't like StarCraft 2, but I think you would. because they know that people have different preferences, but also the games as artifacts have different affordances, like we heard in the previous talk, actually. So people do make a difference between these two different types of things. And that means you can talk about games without them actually being played or specific players in them. Yeah. Do I have 1 minute now or something? Or? Oh, I have my conclusion slide. Yeah. So, first of all, the name Zero Player Games is wrong because they have players in some sense, especially the AI players. Maybe what they mean is non-human games or something. Games without players as humans might be slightly more convoluted name for it. So they're wrong in saying Zero Player Games. But in the same sense, saying that games need players is also a bit wrong. There's a bit more nuance you might need. We clearly have assumption of what a player is. But we're not always explicit on doing that. And when we have disagreements about what a game is, the game research field has been arguing about what a game is, people have different definitions. I think part of that problem might be that we actually have different assumption of what a player is. So it's not only the definition of games, it's the definition of players maybe. Now, you could take the characteristics we've mentioned here as a starting point for what a player should be. I guess, Gordon, if you want a definition of a player, you can use our characteristics because we don't want that definition, rather obviously. But we don't want to make the point that you should have a true definition of what a player is. It's more along the lines that when we give a presentation about research we've done, about the game phenomenon in some sense, it's good not only to talk about what kinds of games we're talking about, which several people did in this conference, but possibly also what we mean by players. Not that one is right or wrong, but it makes it easier for us to understand each other if we're a bit more explicit about that in the beginning. And that's basically our talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk, and we're going to ban Gordon from having any comments, of course. But no, we take the first...
Can I have questions?
We take the first question from this gentleman here. Yes.
Well, as you didn't mention that they are video and computer games, so I assume that this is for every games, any game.
Yes, I was thinking of saying that, and obviously I missed. I'm talking about all types of games. Mea culpa.
Okay. So there's a classic statement that is, this is the game, so I play. And that can be, I play, so this is a game. But you are talking about, it's being played, so it is a game. We should make a clear distinction between playing a game and watching a game being played. We have seen games being played. There is also a reference about Levi-Strauss. I'll make a reference about Levi-Strauss that explains how in ancient cultures, mythologic cultures, there were fixed games that it were games, but the outcome of this game would be always the same, you know, and still they were a game, not intentional, just ritual. So I think that the game is related to the subject. And the subject were not mentioned in your talk. So, what a game is depends on what the subject understands as a game. And as any games can be mentioned, I can think that it is a game that the waves playing with the rocks, for me, is a game. I can see it's a game. And the wind playing with tree and the leaves, for me, it can be a game. And I watch it and I understand as a game. There is no player. The only player is the subject. That I am the subject which is playing in that particular case. So still, although I'm watching a game being played, I'm playing that game. Is it possible?
Repeat the last. Because that was the question, right?
Yeah. Although I'm watching a play being played, the subject that is playing that game, it's myself. So I am playing that game. I am playing that game, although it's been playing.
So I'll try to answer your question there. It's, first, one thing is, of course, play is kind of, is it a multi-stable activity maybe? Because it can mean quite a lot of things. As a Swede, we have two different words, one for gaming and one for playing. So I actually like that English is starting to use gaming more and more, differentiating from playing. That's one part, kind of. Another one is, so when you're saying you can see the leaves playing, the wind playing in the leaves, or leaves playing in the wind, which is the subject there. Of course, you can ask, is it playing or gaming? That's one thing. But it's also that I'm viewing it and interpreting it. It's the same with the AI. Is it a game being played or not? It depends on if, I would say, it depends on if I see that there's intentionality there or not. And if I myself am doing it, I can actually, if I'm playing tic-tac-toe with some kid, am I playing if I'm following a given algorithm, which I know will lead to a certain outcome? I would say I'm not gaming at that point. I might say I'm playing because playing is overloaded with meaning. So I tend to like to say that gaming is a more specific activity within the play. Is that kind of an answer? Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for your presentation. I really like it, but at the same time, I want to resist your ideas. And when you say that zero players game can have players that are not human, I still want to believe that they are always human. That the problem is that we are looking at the wrong place and maybe at the wrong time when we try to define what a game is. Mm-hmm. For instance, for me, gaming in zero player games take place in a different place or a different time than in other games. For instance, in most of your examples, the game in which there were two squares, black and white squares, for me the gaming doesn't take place when you are watching the squares moving. But when you decide when to enter the web page, how to bully the other player, when you are molested by the next player, and so on. Or when you have to write the algorithm for your robot to fight another algorithms and another robot, that's the gaming. So for me, there is always a human component, but maybe the human component is located somewhere else. What do you think?
So I'm happy that you think that, because it seems like you can be more precise in what you are interested in and what you mean, which is kind of the point of the paper, right? Not that everybody should agree with it, because I hope I didn't give a specific view of how you should treat it. So yes, the temporality that when you're doing some actions, then you're playing the game. That's one way of looking at games. And if you're interested in humans, I brought up the quote so you could see it now, Gordon. Obviously, that's more interesting. Or maybe it's not, because maybe being a spectator for the games is an interesting thing to do research on also. So humans can be involved in other roles than players, as the constructors of the AIs or as spectators. So But if you want to look at the activity of gaming or playing with humans, then it makes more sense to look at those parts. But then the spectator is another. So if it helps to be more specific, then I'm happy. You might not be happy that I'm not disagreeing with you, but yeah.
I like your idea. It's just.
I guess we can discuss more later.
Yeah, I think because we're a bit short on time, because the Media Lab closes at 7 because it's another activity. So I'll just give Gordon a chance to defend his honor.
Hi.
I like your model.
Great. No, my question was more about definition of game. I mean, it's easy to say anything you like about games if you pull pull them in any direction. I hear lots of people call Facebook a game, but it's just because one calls it such is not such, just because there's a nominal kind of definition to it. I'm wondering whether what your definition is, because all this is predicated upon a definition or view of games.
Yep.
And whether, since this is co-written with Jesper Juul, right?
Yep.
And in Jesper Juul's definition, player effort and player's attachment to outcome and so on is part of that definition. So.
Yeah, because we do reference Jesper's definition of a game in the paper. So I guess the zero-player games can fit in his definition, otherwise he would be screaming. He might be saying something on Twitter now, he's following the stream. So Jesper has a published definition of games. I'll let that be his answer to it, right? You're asking about my definition of a game. My definition of a game might be seen as a cop-out, but I think it shows where actually I think the most interesting part with game research is, and it might be surprising to you. My definition of what a game is, it's an artifact to support gaming. To me, the most interesting parts of games is the gaming activity. So in one weird sense, I might be agreeing with all these people with the quotes, which I didn't agree with. The thing is, the activity and the artifact are different things, and we tend to confuse them quite a lot. The artifact supports, through its affordances and so on, gaming, but it can also support a lot of other activities, which we, in some sense, call playing. But yeah, I have friends who have met their future wives by playing text-based MUDs. They have been flirting while playing the game, so they've been doing other activities. You can make money by playing. I don't want to call everything you do with a computer game or a game playing. In the same way, I don't want to say, if I take a book and just turn the pages without looking, I'm not reading. If I'm sitting on a book, I'm not reading. So I would like to say that games can support a gaming activity, and it can support a lot of other activities.
And that's the confusion, because we often, exactly as you're saying, call games as objects, games, and games as activities, games.
Yeah.
And that's where I make that distinction as well.
And the additional point is that by breaking these two apart, we can start talking about how people game other things. Gaming the system is a concept in English. If you're a teacher, you know that your students typically game your course, and so on. So gaming, to me, and here I'm getting philosophical, but I guess this is the right place to do it. Gaming is one way for us to kind of interact with the reality. The other one is probably narratives. Was that an answer? It was, yeah.
Okay, I think we really have to stop now, because the restaurants now have prepared lunch for us, so it's more or less ready. So we've asked Andreas if he will kindly wait until after lunch, and he said he will oblige with that. So, and thanks very much to Staffan for a very provoking and entertaining presentation.